Okay. Today is August 26th, 2020. This is the Kubernetes Data Protection Working Group meeting. So today we have mainly one item on the agenda, which is to continue our discussion on the data protection workflows. I think we went through this last time. I think for the use case section, I hope that we have made some good progress. So Xiangqian, Tom, Stephen, you guys want to talk about this? So who want to talk about this?
Yeah, sure. I can give a quick update.
Okay, so should we, okay, you want to, should I make you a co-host so you can share your screen? Should we go review this, this doc, or what is the plan?
I think we haven't really synced up on this doc again since we did do one meeting on the doc.
Okay.
I think we kind of added some more definition, added more sections. We haven't really fully fleshed it out completely.
Okay.
But we can maybe go through some of this if we want.
Yeah, I think that would be good. I can get some feedback from other people as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Let me share my screen.
So let me make you a co-host so you can share. Let's see. All right. Sorry, I can't find you now.
Oh, no problem.
Okay, there you are. Okay. Let me stop sharing.
Perfect. You see my screen okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I think we collected the feedback from the last meeting, which was that I think we added a lot more scope than what we had taught, than I think what the section kind of required. And we did a bunch of work on defining some personas. I think Krishna and Stephen added some of this as well, right? So maybe I can just share my screen if you guys want to walk through some of the things you added, and we can dive into details and get feedback on that. Stephen, I think you added this section, correct?
I did. So I'm having minor technical difficulty. Give me 1 minute because everything's all worked on my end. Just 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. And I'm happy to proxy for you if needed.
All right, my laptop is no longer screaming at me. Sorry about that. Yeah, so basically what we did is we put together, sort of the top part here, you see the personas, right? And we basically said, there's 3 people that are going to care in these use cases. Now, not everybody's going to care about every use case. So you've got the app owner, you've got a cluster admin, and then you usually have some sort of central backup. And then what we tried to do, and we won't necessarily go through all these use cases, but if we scroll down, we basically said, look, when you do a backup, you might just be backing up an application, right? And so if you back up the application, obviously, there's a certain set of steps in the process. So the person who cares about backing up an application will either be your app owner or the central admin. Basically in our world, right? If the app owner cares enough, they'll take an active role. If they don't, then the central admin is sort of responsible. And basically to back up an application, you've got to have some mechanism to specify the components. We sort of have an open question, I think, on, all right, so you have to be able to specify what components make up your app. Do we want a mechanism, a standard way to specify components that are external to the cluster? Or is that sort of an exercise left to each of the implementers, each of the readers, each of the users? For example, AWS just sort of triggered their ACK stuff. I know Caston, I think you guys have a mechanism to specify external resources, that sort of thing. You've got to have a way to specify your custom operations, your QES, log truncation, your pre and post scripts, basically. You're going to select what kind of backup, and a couple of the most common types are you going to want it to be app consistent? Are you going to want to do sort of all those pre and post scripts? Or are you going to be happy with crash consistent? And one of the things we talked about is, frankly, throughout the course of the day, you may choose to do 1 app consistent and 5 crash consistent, because app consistent is obviously a lot bigger impact on the application running. And you'll also have a choice of, do you just want to do snapshots, or do you also want to do data copy? I know most backup apps at this point offer both mechanisms. And then the last is just, you've got to specify where you want the backups to go, right? And things like failure handling, how long till you time out, how many resources could you fail backing up before you fail it. So this is kind of the process, right? You specify what needs to get done, and then this is then the exercise again left in our mind, the backup vendor, which is go take care of it. Go do it however you want to do it, right? Some of the requirements we talked about in terms of making this happen, again, encryption is going to be important. Again, some mechanism to identify what makes up your application. Again, some mechanism for the app intelligence to be able to inject scripts and operations, define the dependencies, all those sorts of things. A mechanism to be able to do crash consistent. This is where we figure there's a dependency on consistency groups, which we know the storage team is working on. Again, the snapshot backup, I know one of the things that comes up a lot and when we talk to customers is snapshots disappear and objects disappear depending on the type of retention policy you put. But if it's delete, an object gets deleted, then that's pretty sad. If you have a retention period for a snapshot that needs to meet a governance requirement. And then obviously some requirement to be able to reasonably easily do data level backups. Again, this is where we know, Valero uses Restic and is able to hook into containers. Obviously, again, Caston has tools like Canister. And then again, are we going to have some sort of standard mechanism to specify external resources? So this is kind of how we view sort of, this is how you do an app backup. These are some of the things you need to have there. Not trying to prescribe how to do it, just this is what needs to be done.
Yeah, really, really good, thanks. Do you just want to go through the rest of the types of backups we discussed as well?
Let's go faster. Basically, namespace in our mind is, there's 2 reasons you do a namespace backup when we talk to people. One is, look at a group of apps and I don't want to do them one at a time. The other, which is probably more common and something we've learned from the VMware, is if someone doesn't specify everything, you want a default policy. It just says, grab all the other stuff because you might need it later. And it's sort of the equivalent of a default policy when you back up VMs. And so you may have, again, it's probably more the central admin that will trigger the namespace backup that will just say, just in case, grab it all. But otherwise, it's pretty much the same as an app backup, just with a lot less, more crude. And then the cluster backup, again, is basically get me all the namespaces plus any other stuff I need to recreate the cluster, which I think, again, is where most people, I think, actually start. And I think the only questions that come up here when we talk to people are just the permissions of what do you need to be able to access, to be able to back up or restore a cluster, and is that different than an application level, and how do we do RBAC, and those sorts of things. So there's some open questions there, just in terms of, and again, this is more from when I talk to users and customers about how do I get this without being too exposed in terms of what permissions I'm giving my backup software.
Yeah, I'm curious what people's opinion are on cluster backups. I think there's kind of this, maybe not flame war, but there's contention around is backing up like doing an etcd backup sufficient here. My kind of opinion here is that it's not. You should really focus on going through the Kubernetes API to grab objects, including cluster level resources. Do people have an opinion here? Does anyone want to take a counter stance, and we can discuss it?
One thing that I want, sorry, go ahead, Prashant.
I was just saying, can you elaborate more as to why you think etcd backups are not good? Again, I don't have a view on this, but just trying to understand more.
I think there's a lot of components that if I'm doing like disaster recovery of a cluster, a lot of things in etcd no longer make sense, right? Nodes, for example, it's likely that you're going to be using new nodes, and doing a restore of etcd doesn't, I think, is will cause more issues than maybe else, right?
So you are saying actually you don't really use that at all. You just completely control the backup yourselves. That's what you're not really build other things on top of it, but you don't want to use the etcd backup at all. It's your suggestion.
Yeah, I can add on to that.
Go ahead, Krishna.
May I? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I will refrain from my point of view on whether we need cluster as a whole as an entity to be backed up or not. But if we are doing it, I will tell why etcd may not be a right candidate, right? There are, with cloud, there are a lot of managed Kubernetes services coming into picture. And none of these managed Kubernetes services may have option to directly take a backup of etcd. So you will not have access to etcd at all. In that case, if you are a backup vendor supporting that particular cloud providers managed Kubernetes service, then you need to do it through API model, Kubernetes API model. That's one point of view.
I think the other argument against doing etcd that I've seen is that the resource IDs, for example, we have volume IDs. It might be an EBS volume or a vSphere volume ID or whatever. If you back up etcd, those volume IDs are baked into the etcd backup. So if you try to restore it as a duplicate, it winds up pointing back to the original objects, and that's not a great thing.
The other point is there are certain resources which are like subcluster specific, like your root CA, and by that your service account tokens and all that, which are not portable across clusters. That is also a reason why etcd backups may not work. The other point that I wanted to clarify was, when we say cluster backup, are we talking about infrastructure, or are we talking about cluster level resources only?
When you say infrastructure, are you, for example, talking about like the VM state and that kind of thing that you're running, which are running your Kubernetes nodes? Are you talking about? Can you elaborate on that a bit, please?
My point of view is when we say cluster backup, at least my point of view is not the infrastructure, the Kubernetes objects and the data, state, config data, not the infrastructure, because you can install Kubernetes anywhere across on-prem, at edge, and even on cloud, and the infrastructure varies widely.
So probably there are different use cases, I guess. Yeah, so I think we are focusing on more a narrow scope to start with, which is more at application level and the volume level and even cluster level. I think this is like the next step, much bigger scope.
Yeah. I think what from our previous discussions, I'm not sure if I'm remembering this correctly. I don't know if we called out backing up infrastructure as out of scope for this effort.
Yeah, I think it's right now it is out of scope, and we can talk about it. I'm just saying that for if you look at our charter, some of those are right now out of scope. So it's going to be like future.
So one more thing around the etcd backup, most of these container distributions, Rancher and so on, are providing some backups based on etcd. Are we saying that those backups are not good enough? they provide cluster level backups, just directly backing up etcd, and they provide some different levels, I believe, backing up just versions or configurations, and I'm not sure if it's cluster resources as well, but just trying to understand that if there are distributions that are suggesting etcd kind of backups, are we saying that those backups won't be enough from what we are kind of looking at the landscape and figuring out what needs to be protected from a protection point of view?
I guess that depends on the issue. Yeah, right. So if it's an etcd corruption, then that backup should suffice for recovering your cluster.
Got it. I think what would be useful is kind of if we document what does an etcd backup include, and then kind of look at it from the other angle. What would a user want to restore to get his applications back up again?
So for example, I think let's say that an etcd backup would just be treat it like an application and just have an exact copy of the same etcd cluster. Store your app. Then the question for me is, what are the deficiencies with that? I will say that it does work well. There are cases where it works well. And my question with asking this was kind of, do we want to, is that worth bringing up in this context of cluster backups, right? Because there are use cases where if you restore in place, if you want to do a rollback or something, potentially etcd can work well. And it is, as you say, supported by different distributions. And I wonder if that's worth discussing in this section as well.
I think we can add that just for the completeness, but we just call out that that's not our focus.
Yeah, the scenarios in which I think taking a backup of etcd would actually help is like scenarios where you are actually upgrading etcd, let's say. Where you're running your own etcd, not a managed Kubernetes service, you're running your own, then in that case, and you are managing the lifecycle of etcd cluster itself. So in that scenario, when you are the etcd operator yourself and you're performing upgrades, in such scenarios, you are better off taking a backup of etcd before you actually upgrade it. So those are scenarios where taking an etcd backup would be useful. But for a more sophisticated, like a high level construct, understanding Kubernetes applications, you would want to go through the Kubernetes API server to back up your resources.
I think the way you broke it down was very good. So what you're saying is basically anything to do with Kubernetes infrastructure, we should use etcd backups, but anything to do with Kubernetes user applications and everything, it requires more granular control.
I would decouple and say whenever you're backing up etcd only, or whenever you're operating etcd alone, backing up etcd is good. But whenever you're trying to back up Kubernetes resources, it is better to go through the Kubernetes APIs instead of directly going to the underlying storage.
And so Kubernetes resources do include infrastructure as well, right? I mean, if you look at a node, that really is kind of infrastructure. That's a Kubernetes resource that maps to some infrastructure. And so do we, as a group, want to form an opinion here? Let's say if I want to back up my nodes, does it make sense to back them up through the API level or through backups, or do we remain kind of unopinionated? Or
what is your definition of infrastructure here? You think that would include what? It basically meaning the entire cluster, including the nodes and everything.
And the load balancer.
But that I don't think that's not our focus, right? But if you're
Yeah.
just talking about other resources and configuration, like stateful set and config map, and those we need, right?
Correct.
So the way I would look at it is you're taking resources from one Kubernetes cluster and you're trying to move it to another Kubernetes cluster. So at which point you already have the infrastructure set up in your destination cluster.
That's correct.
Recreating nodes would not be useful. because there is no controller that is watching for node objects to be created to go provision new infrastructure resources.
Correct.
We've had people looking at doing like array-based copies, you know, just basically copying all the storage. And like for vSphere, that also means you copied all the VMs. But we run into a lot of issues there with object identity. But maybe the thing to do, like for etcd backups, is define the scenarios where it's actually viable. So like, for example, like etcd loss. Backing up the etcd disks is a good way to get back quickly from that. It's not good for movement. It's not good for duplication. Even rollback is a little problematic because you'll wind up with dangling objects potentially.
That's
But
correct.
Yeah.
we're sort of way off of use cases at this point. We've gone.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying here is just, you know, find the use cases where etcd backups would actually be useful.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, again, I think what I heard here was, again, from a cluster point of view, we're not going to help people restore like the physical aspects of their cluster. Cool. I think I heard if someone's managing their own etcd, they should back up etcd, restore etcd, which is really outside the life cycle of Kubernetes. Also cool. We probably do need some way to protect all the assets in a Kubernetes cluster and be able to restore those to a different. Do I have that about right? Just from
let me chime in a little. Sure. Can I share one point over here? The whole point of conducting cluster backup, we define over here with Steven and the team, is that think about it from the personnel's perspective that Tom introduced before, right? As a cluster admin, if your cluster is big, there's no easy way for the cluster admin to understand every single application. However, they might need to comply with org policies, saying that you need to back up your production system in a periodic way. So in this case, the easiest approach for them is to take a backup of the whole cluster. Yes, there will be situations where objects are not portable in different environments, like nodes, events, etc. But I think this can be another problem solved in the restore process, where you take a complete backup of the cluster. However, during the restoration, you have some kind of sophisticated selection mechanism or whatever UI to pick and select. So I think we can treat these two problems slightly differently. The reason why, in a lot of cases, why XCD backup alone won't work is that it cannot handle volume backups effectively. I think in the data protection working group's concept, the cluster admin, cluster backup not only includes the cluster resources, the Kubernetes resources, but also the volume data as well. That's one couple 2 cents from me.
The one question I had on the cluster level backup, and this will betray my ignorance, is to your point, you know, hey, I want to make sure everything's protected. Can I do that by simply saying back up all namespaces, or do I specifically, is there something that if I backed up the namespaces that I would be missing at a cluster level that I specifically need a cluster level backup? Because again, from a UI perspective in my backup app, I could say backup cluster, which just turns into really backing up each of the namespaces. Or are there cluster level assets that need to be protected?
There are definitely cluster level assets. So for example, CRDs, storage classes, you know, we found that backing those up and restoring those is pretty useful.
Yeah.
You know, I guess the question is, if I'm doing like a cross cluster migration. So let's say I back up one cluster and I want to restore it somewhere. What can we assume is in the new cluster? Can we assume that it's a completely empty cluster without any initialization? Should we assume that the storage classes and things have already been created? can we assume that the CRDs and maybe even operators and those kind of things have been created as well? I think it's more conservative to say that we wouldn't, but there's a line there too, right? Because you want to assume something, you have to have storage allocated in some way, and whether or not that means you create the storage classes is kind of I think an option, right? Customers have.
So you basically let customer decide whether they want the backup application to create storage class for you or not. Is that?
I'm very biased here. That is what we do back those up. I think it's kind of optional because it depends on what the target cluster has allocated already, right?
Yeah.
I have a question. It seems, sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
It seems like the definition of cluster backup here kind of matches what Velero does, right? That we are copying Kubernetes API objects. We don't necessarily need everything in etcd, but some of the state in etcd. And the question I have is that sufficient, like what Velero does, or does it have gaps like the one we discussed regarding backing up the whole etcd state?
To answer my point of view, I think what Velero does is a good enough solution when it comes to cluster. And I also understand their intent, why they are not using etcd. Given that they support managed clusters on the cloud providers, they go by Kubernetes API way of getting the copy of the cluster objects. I think that's a good route in my opinion.
So then why are we talking about backing up etcd, given all these problems? Like why the Velero way of doing things using API objects is the way? But I think we should talk about that in the context of cluster backup.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still useful to talk about. I mean, I don't want to push this being the right way to do things. I do think it's worth talking about it, even if we decide that we prefer to go at the API level, just because people are doing this. I mean, as I think Prashanto pointed out, it was Prashanto, right, who pointed out that there are many distributions that recommend using etcd backups for cluster backup and disaster recovery. So as a working group, it feels to me like we maybe don't want to. We can have opinions, but we don't want to force people into one way or the other. The question for me is, what are the use cases, and then what things do we want to, what primitives do we want to move forward in the community that would support those use cases? And so it's worth discussing etcd in the use case discussion because people are using it, I think. But I agree. My preference is that we use the API level because we have a lot more control over there. We can do things that are just not possible with etcd, right?
Okay.
I want to emphasize over here, we're not looking for solutions, right? We are listing scenarios in this doc.
Yeah.
Whether or not a cluster backup is something this community or this working group is going to pursue or not is a different story. Does that make sense?
Sounds good. Yeah, that makes sense, and I'm on board. One follow-up question. So does Velero or how it works today, is that sufficient? For example, like we just discussed, service accounts may not match from one cluster to another, or let's say if an app uses some secrets, they may change when we go from one cluster to another. How does Velero take care of those problems, or does it?
I'll let someone from Velero answer, I think. Is Ashish on the call? I thought I saw him here.
Yeah, I am. My memory is kind of failing me at this point because I was trying to do multiple things, but we don't, if I remember correctly, we do back up those resources, but we don't restore them. I think that's a general principle that we've tried to follow. We back up as much as we can, but we kind of control what we restore. So that's been a general principle that we try to follow.
Or is that something that you let user control? They have choices to exclude certain things or include certain things?
Yeah, so even on both backup and restore, users are free to choose what they want to back up at a granularity of resource level. and they can also choose what they want to back up and what resources they want to back up and what resources they want to restore.
Oh, are you saying CRDs are not restoring CRDs? If they are not go ahead.
So if we are backing up a custom resource,
yeah,
but the user did not specifically ask for CRDs to be backed up, we walk the link from CR to CRD and back up the CRD also.
Mm-hmm.
And on restore, we do restore the CRDs as well.
Okay, so you do. Okay, so you do restore actually.
I think there were some things that, it's useful to like remap. So like Valero will remap storage classes, for example. We were looking at that the other day, and using that. And there's like things that get mixed into the cluster resources. So like PVs are cluster level resources. So, if you're only backing up a namespace, do you back up all the PVs if you're doing the cluster level resources? So I think there's a bunch of stuff there to figure out, like how do you filter those out? How do you have ways to change them on restore, and probably in a more generic fashion?
I think changing things on restore is a general problem, not specific to cluster level resources. We found this for many different types of resources, not just CRDs and other cluster level resources. But
yeah, so additive things need to happen at all the levels.
I think the same applies to other resources like cluster roles. If you have a service account in a namespace that's bound to a cluster role, so there have dependencies where application namespace level resources are pointing to cluster level resources.
And also, if you are restoring the CR, it can get tricky, right? Depending on what it's designed to do, it could trigger some new resources to get created.
Yeah, Shane, exactly. That was my first point, right?
Okay.
A lot of heavy logic needs to happen during the restore time, and it needs guidance from the users. But for example, the volume snapshot, it is not easy to restore because you need to literally transform whatever dynamically created volume snapshot objects in the API server into a pre-provisioned snapshot. Otherwise, it just won't work. So that my point in the beginning is that I think is to provide a more or less complete backup so that a restore can happen in case it needs something from the backup. But how to conduct that is the big question. So honestly with you, I think it is a very hard problem to solve.
Yeah, so remember that when you look at the application, CRD, the one from SIG apps, right? Remember that you went through that at one point. I think they don't include CRDs. I believe they only have well-known Kubernetes API objects in there, right? So it's like everything needs to be handled specially. If it's just something that's defined by the application, the application.
Yes.
Remember that, yeah. It does not include something defined by other people. I mean, they only include or well-defined resources in Kubernetes, right? I mean, only like the stateful set or not.
They only support community maintained
CRDs.
Right. That's right.
Because I think they have some like special handling for each of those. So I'm just thinking if it's like a CRD, it's defined by other people, then maybe at the restore time you don't know how to handle it. That could be tricky actually. Yeah,
I think that's a good point. Since you don't know what to do, really the only option is to provide a mechanism that allows kind of user guidance.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you guys are doing currently? I mean, since this is already an existing problem, right? So do you guys?
Mm-hmm. We try to do something by default, but it's often like, especially with operators, because operators, there's so many actions that are triggered when you create PR.
Mm-hmm.
you really have to have mechanisms that will make that customizable, right? You have to let the user kind of specify what happens when you restore those, right?
Okay, yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, we've also kind of seen similar things on our end, backing up the CRs, especially, like giving the example of etcd again. Etcd has a custom resource to do backups and restores, which it puts in a target S3 repository. So if you kind of replay that custom resource, you're technically recreating the backup in a way. So yeah, I completely agree with Tom. There needs to be special ways of handling those scenarios.
Okay, so that's, yeah. Oh, so that's like for every single CR,
Yeah.
you have to handle differently. That's, yeah.
I think this is a problem that's okay to push to the data protection vendors, though, right? I mean, because a lot of data protection is going to be a mechanism that allows this user input and workflows that help define that. I think it'll be difficult to kind of come up with a unified workflow that we can push for in the data protection group, right? Does that make sense, or is that I don't want to impose that opinion?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree with that too.
Okay, cool. Stephen, I apologize for hijacking your.
No, this was good. I mean, the cluster was in fact one of the ones that I thought needed a lot of debate. So I think this is good. And we can keep going, but I don't know if there's other stuff on the agenda.
It's okay, you can keep going. The next agenda can go very quick. So yeah, let's just to keep this.
So the next part, actually, I think, I can't remember who said it, but I prefer the term resource backup is actually better than sub-application backup. But yeah, this is basically just the resource backup. So, hey, I just want to do one little thing, right? And it could be, from our point of view, it could be a customer says, look, again, my application is a few databases plus a web server plus some file services. And they may just want to back up a specific database because they're about to, again, upgrade their MySQL. So they may just want to say, all right, just back up this MySQL, or back up just this volume, or something limited like that. So that's really sort of the intent here. So it's got a lot of the same characteristics as an application backup, but just obviously at a much smaller granularity. Again, generally, this is something only the app owner is really going to care about, because it does tend to be something where they're about to, again, do probably some sort of upgrade or some sort of test that they want to get one in the can before they blow the world to smithereens.
So this basically meaning like everything needed for the application, right? Is it? Like,
well, so the application was literally, so at least the way we were thinking of it is, take customer X, they've got a billing application, or actually probably a better, billing's complicated. Had a discussion with a guitar company that basically it had a Kubernetes application that allowed you to design a custom guitar. And so basically there was a database, there was an external database where they keep a certain amount of information in RDS. They had a couple of databases in Kubernetes as well. They had file services, they had some logic, web front end. So they thought of that as their application. So what they said to us is they said, we want to back up this application. And that's the application backup, is they design your own guitar application. But then they said, there are points, let's say, so they were using, in this case, I think they were using a Mongo for some of it. And they said, but if I'm going to upgrade Mongo, I'd like to be able, sometimes just to be able to say, take a backup of the Mongo. Right? I don't need to back up the whole app right now. I just want Mongo because I'm about to upgrade it. And so that's more that resource or sub-application backup of not looking to do the whole thing, just one component, because that's the component I'm about to mess with. That makes sense?
Yeah, that can also be tricky, right? Just back up that one component. When you restore it, does it work well with the rest of the application?
And to some extent, that's a user choice. And so what they understand is where they have dependencies versus loose dependencies. And so from their point of view, Mongo's got a loose dependency with the rest of the application so that they would be able to roll that back. If
Okay.
that's the case, then they would not take advantage of this option. So
Okay.
again, and that's why I think the app owner drives it, because I think the app owner is the one that understands that the central admin's not going to do that, right? And certainly not the cluster admin.
Mm. Okay.
Stephen, do you see it being something similar to this, where there is some kind of input required, right? Because in that case, you could back up the entire instance of the Mongo, entire Mongo instance, or you could back up individual collections, for example.
Right, and so that was where we got into the discussion with them, where again, this comes to, they wanted to be able to label the guitar application as this is the guitar application, and then they almost wanted like a sub-label where they'd say this is Guitar Mongo, so that they could say I just want to back up Guitar Mongo as opposed to all of guitar.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't, and that was an area where I wasn't sure. I mean, I assume they can put multiple labels on any given Kubernetes object. So, but I didn't promise that. It's not like we have a product to ship them. So it's very easy to tell them to do whatever they want. It's imaginary for us.
Hey, in this example, even the Mongo can also have subcomponents, right? So in some sense, this is becoming a composite application kind of a scenario where we have applications and there are kind of composite applications which are made up of multiple applications, and the backups can be dealing with a single application or a composite application kind of a scenario.
Yeah, and that's why under the requirements, I did the, they wanted some way to specify like a hierarchy in the application so that they could build up that composite that way. And again, I don't have any religion on how you do it, but that was the customer's ask. And we've had that from quite a few customers, whether it's the guitar or a building or any sort of application. They want sort of this ability to have define the elements of the composite application so they can treat it as either the full application or any subcomponent all the way down to a resource. And so as long as Kubernetes supports.
Still, can I ask a question?
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a question? Why cannot this be achieved by labeling, natural labeling support in Kubernetes?
Yeah, that was certainly what we told them, and I think as long as the group is okay with that being the implementation, I'm fine. I just wanted to put the use case down of this is something people want to do. That was where we were guiding them, was you're probably going to do this with labels. But from a use case perspective, we just need to solve it. If the group all agrees that labels is a way to solve it, we'll put that in the how.
I agree with the use case. It's a very important use case. I don't agree with labels because I don't think it's going to work longer term, because we're at some point, all we see as Kubernetes labels at this point are things like PVs and stuff. And so if we want to do application specific backup, like actually use the MongoDB backup, we need to be able to trigger that as well. But that's outside of this. This as a use case, this is something we really need to support, however it works.
Yeah, that might be a good discussion for the hooks section, like the quiesce, unquiesce, and logical section, right?
Dave, are you referring to like using Mongo's own tool to do backup, or
yeah?
What are you,
I mean,
okay.
Yeah, I mean, eventually we want to be able to let the application back itself up if it can.
Yeah, so this actually also, I think this is one question that came up when Xiangqian and I gave the talk on our working group. I think it was one question on whether it should let the application do its own backup or it should have Kubernetes do it.
I think the answer is yes. You have to do both because some applications won't do their own backup.
I agree.
So yeah, so probably need to have like a hybrid approach. So you mean that if we want to do that, you cannot use the labels too, but the label can still help to pick up the correct resources, right? That this is like, we probably need some other configuration to some flag to say, okay, we want to go this way to back up this way, not using this other way.
I think we can use labels for some of the things, but for example, like if your only option for backing up MongoDB is snapping all of the persistent volumes and doing block level copies, that's not really, you know.
Oh, okay, I see what you're saying.
I think thinking it from a perspective of like backing up MongoDB as kind of is a very narrow, seems like a very narrow scenario. What I would suggest is there are think of people labeling their applications and saying they want to back up all resources associated with this application. That is when you would use a label selector to find out all resources that are associated with an application and back them up. So I would kind of try to think of using label selectors in that way. And I feel that that is a scenario we should kind of think about.
Stephen, you kind of mentioned, you discussed application definition, and I think that's relevant here, right? What is the grouping of things you're backing up?
Yeah, we had both, I think, in the requirements, ability to identify what comprises an application, and then to Dave's point, the app intelligence as well. Right? So sort of, and so, yeah, so the assumption, I didn't want to copy the requirements for each one, you know, because it would just make the document redundant. So that's why in the requirements, most of them say all of the things in the application plus, right? It's just, there's always more requirements. There's never less.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of requirements. I guess, Dave, does the intent here kind of capture what you're describing, where there's multiple mechanisms to define what an application is, and therefore kind of the approach you should take to back it up?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is requirements. So, you know, whether or not we use labels is a whole different argument.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Again, wanted to stay away from recommendations of how. I hate it when product managers do that.
Yeah, well, I think I had that in this section, so we can clean that up probably.
They're notes.
Yeah. Do you want to run through recovery as well, Stephen?
We could try. We got 8 minutes left.
Yeah.
So let's start with the application one. So again, I mean, this you know, many of the recoveries mirror the backups, though I think it might have been wasn't Dave, but it was anyway, Ashish maybe. It was Ashish that brought up that an application recovery could be a recovery of an application backup, but it could also be that I did a namespace or a cluster backup, and then on the restore specified the components of the application. So I don't want to necessarily assume a one-for-one mapping there. But the intent here certainly is you somehow select the application that was backed up, either because you backed it up as an application, or again, like Tom was saying, I've got a user interface of some sort that allows me to select the components that comprise the application you know, during the restore, since I didn't do it during the backup. Obviously, they're going to pick a place to restore it to, and then handwave. Magically, the backup thing sort of recreates all the stuff that was there, right? The Kubernetes metadata, the volumes, all of that stuff that makes my application come back. And again, didn't want to get super prescriptive on which objects and how we deal with it. But some of the requirements here, again, you're going to need a mechanism to specify the components. Again, that may be a backup application thing, but obviously you're going to need that. Some of the ones that do come up though is some sort of guidance or you know, standard order of operations, I think is useful as people build backup applications. That becomes a big deal. Another one is if we did allow them to specify dependencies on external objects, again, an RDS database, for example, we probably need a standard mechanism to allow them to trigger the recovery. If we decide that's out of scope, then again, that becomes sort of a one-off per vendor, per external resource kind of thing. Either one is okay there. But I think we do need to decide on whether we're going to bring that into scope or not. I left off here, and I probably put it in a different part. All right, the assumption here was that you're restoring to a totally alternate location. So Tom, to your point before, I'm not worrying about any conflicts, any overwrites, any, hey, I'm hitting an object or something of the same name. That comes up in the rollback, though, that I think one of the challenges there is how do we deal with sort of identifying are there standard ways to sort of cope with I'm encountering an object and I need to know what to do, or again, is that something we leave up to the backup vendors to sort of sort out on their own? But that will be, I think, a concern certainly for all users of how do you take this back to the last backup and not leave cruft around or make things worse than when we started.
A question, you're saying ability to specify order of backing up resources such as backup replication nodes, ports. You mean the resources on those nodes, ports, not backing up the nodes, ports themselves, right? Is that?
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, those shouldn't be in there. It really meant, yeah, you are correct. It really should just be pods and resources.
Okay.
Stephen, you kind of mentioned something interesting there. When you say application rollback, you're talking about overwriting existing things, and then for recovery, you're talking about net new. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that was the distinction, because as we've met with customers, there's always those two sorts of flows. One says, look, I'm always going to restore it, either maybe same namespace, but I want to prefix the restored objects with a different prefix. And then there's the other of, nope, we want to, especially, frankly, I found with people who have like a NetApp background, I want to snap restore my application. You're like, I'm not sure it means the same thing here as what you think it means anymore, but they're awfully insistent that they should be able to do it.
Now, does the rollback require a revert? Is that needed?
Yeah, so and that's why we say it doesn't mean what you think it means. In a NetApp world, when I snap restored a volume, it was a sort of a single point in time rollback. I mean, it destroyed data, but all it said was your storage goes back to a point in time. They want to apply that to the whole application here, which means pods, secrets, the whole deal, which to me is a lot scarier. But again, they seem to think that they should be able to do that. And we can tell them they're nuts and not support it, but I get that a lot from people who just would like to be able to sort of, someone did
we're getting it too. Maybe it's worthwhile to go through and list out the reasons why it's not going to work and just put it to bed.
I guarantee you'll still get it even if you give those reasons. So
at least you can say, here's why we're not doing it.
That's true, yeah. I think we're out of time. Thanks a lot, Cedar, for the thing. That was really useful. We can maybe continue. There's more stuff, so maybe we can do that next time.
So we can maybe continue. You have more on the resource side. Yeah, we can continue next time.
Yeah, because recovery is actually, I think, as Ashish pointed out, recovery is harder than backup, sadly.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, guys. This is really, really impressive.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. And this kind of effort is going to definitely guide us in the future, what components we needed. Again, I want to clarify, this is the use case collection phrase. We are not targeting at designing or deciding the direction directly at this moment. I actually encourage everybody to take a look at this talk. It's really well written, and put your comments over there. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Steven, and all others working on this this initiative.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, guys.
So I'm just wrapping up. So we do have other sections. I think some I think we scheduled time to discuss, and so I think actually I should probably go to this other doc. So if you have a sign up for this, please reach out to each other that are in the same group with you, and maybe we can make some progress there for those other sections as well. And then just a quick update about our talk. So I think it went well. It's just the timing wise, it's very early in the morning, like 5 o'clock, 5:30 Pacific time. But I think it went well. So I think we got some questions, some very good questions. One question we got is actually we got several questions about the Velara, like how is this different from Velara? What you guys are doing different from Velara? So basically, we're saying we're not really. We are just providing some tools that Velara can use. We're trying to work on those missing pieces in Kubernetes, and Velara is actually part of this working group. I think there's another question which is about when we are going to support change block tracking. So I think that was actually in our charter. So probably I think I'm going to add that as in this doc as well, because that's maybe something that we could also think about a little bit.
Awesome, yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and then
is it providing change block tracking as part of the CSI spec itself or something outside?
We haven't even talked about that yet. So that's
okay.
Yeah, it's like a brand new topic. We just have not got a chance to talk about that. So probably we should at least talk about what that is, why we need it in our white paper. It's not like we're not starting the design yet, but at least talk about why we need it, things like that. Okay. I think we are running out of time. So thank you, everyone. And
thank you, Jing.
Talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye now.